Morning everyone, thank you for joining us for this webinar. The purpose of this session is to provide you with a full update on the revised furlough scheme, the new furlough scheme that's come back into place at quite short notice. The reason why we've decided to run this session for you is that we've had lots and lots of questions about the new scheme, including lots of kind of detail on the rules. And so pulled together a few of the experts in the team that have been looking at this and try to think about all the questions that we've been asked and put that into one session for you. So I hope you'll find that useful. If you do want to contact us with any further thoughts or questions, then you can find details for that in the invitation that you received to attend today. So just to introduce you to who we've got here today, Sarah Peacock, who's a partner in our Southampton team, James Collings, a partner in the team in Truro, Charlie Maples. Charlie's a managing associate, and Charlie has been working tirelessly on providing many of the updates that you've seen. Quite often they do have my name on them, but I'll let you into a secret. Quite often it's Charlie that's done most of the hard work on those late at night. So it'd be really good to hear from Charlie today. Just to start, so over to Sarah. So Sarah, we're going to sort of start off talking first of all about the specifics of the scheme and the basics of it. So just as a reminder, can you talk about who can claim under this extended CJRS?
Yes, so if you're claiming for a period that ends on or before the 31st of October, you can only claim if you've previously furloughed your employees before the 1st of July and have submitted a claim for this by the 31st of July. So this might differ if they're returning from parental leave. If you're claiming for a period that starts on or after the 1st of November, then you can only claim for furloughed employees that were employed and on the payroll on the 30th of October. So this means that you must have made an RTI submission to HMRC between the 20th of March and the 30th of October, notifying a payment of earnings for that employee. As under the previous scheme, you can claim for employees and workers on any type of employment contract, so 0 hours, flexible working, part-time, full-time, etc. And there's actually no maximum number of employees that you can claim for from the 1st of November.
Thanks, Sarah. I think that's really helpful. So basically it's about sitting down and looking at the relevant dates and making sure that the employees that you want to claim for were on the RTI at the relevant time. And I meant to mention at the beginning, actually, one of the key things that is a change from what businesses were planning previously is that the CJRS bonus that was due to be payable has been withdrawn because of the extension of the scheme. We've heard from a number of clients that cash amount had already been put into the cash flow, so that is actually quite a disappointing element. I think it does make sense from a sort of policy perspective, because with the scheme being extended, the idea of having a bonus for returning people from furlough becomes undermined. But it is something to very much note, and if it's something that you haven't seen yet, do take notice of that, because certainly your finance teams might have been relying on that money coming through. So thinking about what you were saying there, do businesses need to have used the furlough scheme previously to be able to use it this time?
No, so you can use it for the first time as long as you meet the criteria. So just to remind you about that, if you cannot maintain your workforce because your operations have been affected by coronavirus, you can furlough employees and apply for the grant to cover a portion of their usual monthly wage costs. As long as you record them as being furloughed, subject obviously to what I've just said about them being on the payroll.
Yeah, and you mentioned that it covers a wide range of employees and workers. What about employees who are on maternity leave? What are the options there?
Yeah, so with maternity leave, the employee can come off furlough. So what they can do is they can give their 8 weeks notice that they have to give normally. And then at the end of that 8-week notice period, then that they can be furloughed. Of course, actually, if the scheme ends before they've intended to return, they're not going to be able to go back on maternity leave. So they need to be aware of that. But there is a funny little quirk in it. So the guidance in a different section says that if your employee is on or who has recently returned from statutory parental leave, so that's any parental leave, not just maternity leave, you can claim through the scheme for enhanced contractual pay. So it's not absolutely clear, but what we understand that to mean that if your employee receives enhanced contractual maternity pay or something similar, they can be furloughed simultaneously, but you will only be able to claim back the 80% of the enhancement, not the statutory pay. So obviously that's not the case for those employees that only receive statutory pay. They have to come off maternity leave first to be.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's perhaps quite unexpected, isn't it? So that's definitely one that's worth looking at.
Yeah.
I do think, I mean, I think it would depend on, you probably, I mean, we'll talk about sort of reputational issues later, but you probably want to be using the scheme more generally rather than just using it for those specific examples within the business, I think.
Yeah, very much so.
Charlie, we've talked in the team quite a bit on the updated guidance and what it means in relation to notice periods. You know, we've got lots of clients that were already looking at restructuring for various different reasons. So what's the headline change in respect of notice and furlough?
So the headline change was, it was signalled in the guidance they issued, and then last week it was confirmed that you cannot claim for employees that are working under notice where that notice falls on or after the 1st of December. That's a significant change, because under the old version of the CJRS, you could continue to furlough and claim for people who are working contractual or statutory notice. So it effectively means that the old scheme meant you could subsidise notice periods, and lots of our clients extended notice periods to help out their employees, give them longer to get to the job market. You can't do that anymore, because you'll be paying the full cost of any extended notice. You can, however, claim for notice periods that are running before December. So it's only kicking in on the 1st of December. You can claim for statutory or contractual notice that runs up until the end of November.
Yeah, and what should an employer do if they've already got someone on furlough who's going to be serving notice on or after the 1st of December?
Well, I think the real change is there's no real incentive to keep the employee technically employed and working out their notice. So what you want to do about that depends upon whether you can really use them for work or not in reality. So I think if you've got someone who's serving out some of their notice already, then certainly make full use of the scheme until the end of November. In terms of any notice periods that are run part or full after December, I think you can either ask them to return to work, end their furlough and work out their notice period if you've got something that you can require them to do and you feel that they're going to do that. But if you haven't got anything for them to do, which a lot of employers will find themselves in that scenario, that's the reason why this person was furloughed in the first place. If you haven't got anything that you can ask them to do, then you could choose to just pay them in lieu of their notice period, as you might have done in ordinary circumstances. The one minor benefit of doing that would mean that you save on the holiday that would accrue during a notice period, which can be significant if you've got long notices.
Yeah, and what about the pay? So do you still have to pay the employee the normal pre-furlough pay for that notice period, even when you can't claim for it?
Yeah, so the government introduced legislation in relation to the last furlough scheme, which they've now extended to the new furlough scheme, which has got a very long name, and it basically amends the Employment Rights Act. And it basically means that if your employee has got statutory notice, then they're entitled to have that statutory notice calculated in line with their pre-furlough pay. The specific ways in which you calculate that and what the relevant date is, but that legislation was brought in to make sure that you don't base their statutory notice pay on furlough pay amounts, to make sure they get the full benefit of that. The situation is still the same as it was under the old scheme in relation to contractual notice, where you're giving a week or more than you're required to by statutory notice requirements. If you're giving a lot more notice under your contract, then actually what they're entitled to comes down to a matter of contractual interpretation. There is an argument that if you've asked somebody to be furloughed on very express provisions that say that their notice period, for example, will be paid at the furlough rate, if you are giving that lengthier notice, you may be able to say that you can pay the notice at the 80%. In our experience, most people didn't do that sort of express provision when they were furloughing people. And we think there'd be a very good argument, if there's any grey area, a tribunal is likely to say employees were agreeing to be furloughed at 80% of pay in order to keep their job. They weren't agreeing to get 80% of pay for their notice period. So the safest position is going to be paying 100%. Come to us if you think you've got an argument, and we'll have a look at your agreements.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Charlie. James, we've had lots of questions about the interaction between sickness and sick leave and furlough. It's been quite a difficult area to manage in practice. Do you have some thoughts on the practicalities of how employers might want to look at those sorts of circumstances?
Yeah, it's a really challenging area. I mean, I think when you look back, right the way back to the beginning, so back to 9th of April, when there's the update to the original sort of guidance, it made clear that sort of furlough wasn't intended to sort of tackle short-term absences linked to COVID, or because someone was self-isolating. What it said was actually in that sort of scenario, you should be paying SSP subject, or company sick pay subject to eligibility requirements being met. Now, at the time, if you sort of think back, that wasn't as much of an issue as it is now in practice, because the reality was that you had to furlough someone for a minimum period of sort of 3 weeks. So actually, there wasn't as much of a sort of temptation to use it for that sort of self-isolation period and things like that. Now, because we've got this scenario where you can sort of, there's no minimum period of sort of furlough that you have to do it, there probably is more of a temptation for employers to sort of think, well, actually, can we put someone on it? And there is a bit of a challenge there, because it becomes a bit grey. The latest guidance on it basically says short-term illness, self-isolation should not be a consideration when deciding whether to furlough an employee. But if employers want to furlough employees for business reasons and they're currently off sick, they're eligible to do so as with other employees. And in those cases, the employee should no longer receive sick pay and would be classified as a furloughed employee. Now, that creates a bit of a weird grey area, particularly around this sort of question of, well, hang on a second, what exactly is what are the sort of legitimate sort of business reasons why you could furlough? Now, the obvious reason would be, if, for example, you were shutting down an entire factory and you were putting everyone in the factory onto furlough, if there was a few employees there that were off sick at the time or were sort of self-isolating, it's saying, well, actually, it's legitimate to treat them the same way as you would everyone else because you're furloughing everyone, so that's absolutely fine. But we're definitely seeing that there are some challenging areas there, particularly if a particular section of the business has to sort of shut down due to self-isolation issues. Where does that sort of leave us? It is a bit of a challenging area, and the reality is, I think each and every scenario needs to be looked at quite closely to gauge the sort of level of risk there around, what way would HMRC look at that particular scenario later on down the line. So it is a bit of a danger area.
Okay, thanks. And I guess talking about danger areas, Sarah, what do we think around the kind of reputation issues? We now know that HMRC will be publishing the names of employers that choose to use the furlough scheme. So I know we've had quite a few questions about this, where there are grey areas. Employers are starting to think about what that means for their reputation, because this is public money.
Yeah. So yes, from the 1st of December, HMRC can publish the name of the employers, and also the actual amount that they're claiming. So the amount or a reasonable indication of that. So obviously that could result in bad publicity for them, particularly if they're then sort of talking about how profitable they've been and all the rest of it. What is probably more important is that employees can access that information because it will be public, and they can see that if their employer is claiming for employees that are meant to be furloughed and they're actually working, they're not going to be very happy about that. So they can then contact, they can whistleblow, they can contact this anonymous phone line or go through the reporting service, a digital reporting service, and report their employers. So it's sort of a bit of a risky measure. And I think, a lot of employers are no longer going to take advantage of the scheme for that very reason, because they don't want to be named and shamed, basically.
I guess the distinction, I mean, hopefully, I'm pretty sure there's no one on this call that's claiming falsely for furlough. So more around, I suppose, the reputational issue. If the business is still trading in some way, and it's less clear maybe why furlough might need to be used, but there may well be lots of good business reasons why there are COVID factors impacting the business. So what do we think around, employers thinking about that ahead and maybe having a narrative ready? For gender pay reporting, it's possible to have a narrative. Is there a benefit, do we think, in employers sort of thinking about that now as they begin to implement the second part of the scheme? Why will they say they're using it, and what are they, what can they make public about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good idea, so that they can do comments and sort of talk about the reasoning behind that, and that's going to sort of stand them in good stead. And it will also mean that they can prepare comms, so that if there is some sort of statement in the media, then that they can respond to that. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. And I think also the other thing is to make sure that they communicate that with their employees. So if employees know the reasoning behind the furlough and why they're being furloughed and why they're claiming under the scheme, even if they are sort of potentially profitable, then they're less likely to feel disgruntled and blow the whistle on their employers. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Charlie, in the first period of furlough, there were lots of individuals, I think, that we heard about in the media, and probably from people that we knew, who fell just between the cracks. Perhaps they'd only recently started a job, or they'd just left. So in the new furlough, what are the issues around rehiring and furloughing employees who've recently left or been dismissed and are now in a difficult situation because of the new lockdown?
Yeah, you'll still get those people who very recently started and won't meet the cutoff dates. There are always going to be people who miss out on the safety net. What they've done though is they've set a new date by which recent employees who've recently left can be rehired and furloughed. So if someone was employed on the 23rd of September and they were on RTI submission between the 20th of March and the 30th of October, you can re-employ them, furlough them, and claim for them under the CJRS. It's not entirely clear to me how that sits alongside the purpose of the CJRS, which is said to be where employment activities have been adversely affected by coronavirus, or the measures taken to prevent it. Sometimes that person might have recently left because of coronavirus, but sometimes they won't have done. And I think employers do need to bear in mind, do we meet that general purpose before we just knee-jerk rehire people because they've asked and they've read in the guidance they could be?
It's a really good point. And what about employees who are on fixed-term contracts that will end after the 1st of November? What's the position in relation to those?
Yes, the guidance does explicitly say, as was the same under the original CJRS, that you can extend those fixed-term contracts and you can furlough them and claim for them. And again, I'm not quite sure how that fits in with the overall policy aims.
No, that again feels more like a safety net for the individuals who will then potentially really struggle to find an alternative. So it's good for them. But I think
it's at odds, doesn't it, with them not being able to furlough people who are self-isolating, though.
Yes.
Because someone who you don't need in your business is going to get 80% of pay, whereas someone who's got to sit at home to do the right thing in terms of transmission has to have a significant drop in pay.
Yeah, I think that is one of the points that has not been entirely thought through. What should employers consider if they're thinking of re-employing and furloughing employees who've recently left?
Well, I think the first thing is not to be led by your employee. I think if they phone in and say, "Oh, I only just left," Rishi Sunak is and Martin Lewis on Money Expert is saying that I can be rehired. Can you help me out? Obviously, most employers would think, well, I would like to, but I think you have to stop and say, we'll look into it, and then go away and look at the dates, make sure they fit in those dates, and then think about, is it good for the business to do that? And there are a number of reasons why it could or it could not be. The factors I think you should consider would include the costs of re-employing and furloughing them. Obviously, a lot of employees would say, oh, it doesn't cost you anything as a business to have me back and put me on furlough. And employers will know that's not true. It's very, very generous, the support from the government. But whilst they cover 80% of the salary costs, they don't cover NICs and pensions. That would be entirely at the cost of the employer. And they also don't cover the fact that employee would continue to accrue annual leave, and they also don't cover the significant payroll and administrative burden that comes with furloughing people. One of the other factors I think you should think about, if you're inclined to do it, is think about how you want to contract with that employee that left that you're rehiring. Did they have service which has gone when they left, and do we want to therefore make sure we rehire them in a way that breaks that continuity of service? We don't want to be dealing again with having a fair reason for dismissal at the end or facing unfair dismissal claims from them. Probably one of the best ways to think about doing it, therefore, is rehiring on a fixed term contract and tying that to perhaps the end of January, when we know that the levels of contribution from employers may be increasing. Doing it on a fixed term contract also makes a lot of sense now that you can't claim for people on notice periods. You also need to think about, what access to other benefits are we going to give them? And I think also we have, for employers that are asking us to help with it, we've been stating explicitly in contracts for rehire, we don't have to do this. We're doing it to give you the benefit of the scheme, and that is the only purpose of this contract. I think it just makes it very clear from the outset for both parties why you're doing it. Finally, I think the other factors you want to consider are, are you furloughing many other employees anyway? If you're not, it's not very attractive, I don't think, because you're putting yourself to a lot of extra work. But if they're just one in many hundreds of people that you're doing anyway, it's probably less of a concern for you. And finally, some employers are taking an approach of saying, well, I only want to do it for certain employees that have left. For example, I might only do it if I might want that employee back longer term if business changes. That's absolutely fine to have a kind of a policy base on which you're choosing to make decisions to rehire or not. What I would say is that it's good to sort of have some written, not strongly formal policy, but somewhere you've written down and somebody's thought about how are we going to decide who to rehire, what are going to be our policy reasons for doing it or not doing it, because that just means that you can refer to that when you're going back to the employee, and it gives you something to rely on to avoid arguments about discrimination for not rehiring someone.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So assuming that you have been through all of these different thought processes and you are using furlough for a second time, which very many of our clients are, James, what's the overview in terms of the practicalities and sort of technicalities of the written agreement with employees? Has anything changed there?
Yeah, it's interesting on that one. I mean, I think one thing that we get a bit of a sense of, which is quite interesting, is that quite often there's been this sort of assumption from employers that they have the right to furlough someone, that they can almost do that against the person's will, which I think it is important to remember. This is meant to be something being done, by agreement. We don't have a right to place someone on furlough. Now, against that, I mean, in terms of the written agreements, it's always been a factor that employees needed to agree to be placed on furlough, and that needed to be confirmed in writing. Now, if you think way back to the days when it sort of originally came in, you probably recall that there were some sort of initial worries, concerns, things there that, they issued the sort of guidance, people put people onto furlough. We then had the first Treasury direction that was sort of suddenly suggesting that the employee's written consent was needed, and that posed a lot of problems, and some real concerns for people, particularly large employers, because what tended to have happened was they put people onto furlough very quickly. They sent them nice letters, and they were sort of relying on the implied consent of the sort of people, because the practicalities around getting signed documents back from several thousand people in one go was just never realistically sort of going to happen. As the scheme progressed, we had the sort of second Treasury direction that made it clear you didn't need that sort of individual written consent, which eased people's minds quite a lot. And under the new scheme, that's essentially still the same. So it still has to be confirmed in writing by the employer, and there still has to be there's still a point there that you need to retain that written agreement for at least 5 years after it's made, which will be really important in terms of HMRC audits around all this sort of later on down the line, to keep and retain that written agreement in every case, and that can be email as well. It doesn't have to be a letter as such. But yeah, the new scheme there is absolutely, you still have to have that agreement in place, and as a minimum, that needs to confirm that the employee is not going to do any work in relation to their employment, or they're not going to work the full amount. Because bear in mind, we've still got this ability to either fully furlough or to flexibly furlough, with them working some hours and getting paid for those, and being furloughed for the remainder of the hours. I think it's probably important to say that there is a real distinction there. We've seen a few problems linked to it. There is a big distinction between getting it right, getting the agreement right in terms of ensuring that you can then legitimately claim back money under the scheme, and in terms of getting it right in terms of it being really clear to your employees what it means for them in practice and what they can actually expect in terms of their pay, etc. Because if you're not clear enough with the employee around what they're going to get in their pockets and in their pay packets under this agreement, then we've already seen a few where the employees have pushed back on employers, saying, well, actually, you haven't paid me the amount that I was expecting, even though they've paid the correct amount in terms of the calculation under the scheme. The employee's saying, well, actually, that's not what I was expecting. That's not what that agreement sort of indicated I was going to get, and bringing an unlawful deduction of wages claims against the employer linked to that. Now, that's obviously not a position you're going to want to be in. So actually making sure that agreement's really nice and crystal clear around the arrangement is really important in relation to the relationship with the employee, just as much as it is in relation to making sure you can reclaim the money under the scheme.
Thanks, James. I think that is all of the questions that we had that we were going to run through. I don't know if anyone's got anything else they want to add this morning.
Actually, one quick one, Karen, in relation to
Yeah.
the written agreements, that's probably worth just mentioning is linked to the timing of that, of exactly when the written agreement has to be in place. Because I think one thing that we have seen that's sort of been put out there by a few different advisors and things is essentially a point suggesting that written agreement has to be in place before the beginning of the claim period. That individual claim period, which I think we found that's caused confusion for quite a few clients, saying, well, is that right or not? So just to put that quickly into context, if that was the case, so quite a lot of the time, most people are operating a sort of monthly claim period. Now, if that was right, that the agreement had to be in place before the claim period, what that would mean is, if, for example, you wanted to put in place to furlough someone and put in place a furlough agreement in the middle of December. If that was right, you couldn't put an agreement in place then, because you would have had to put it in place before the beginning of December to make that work. That clearly isn't. We think that what was sort of intended around that regard, and I think actually it does seem to be the case that some advisors have sort of just misread the guidance, because what it talks about is that the agreement has to be in place before the beginning of the period to which that particular claim relates. Now, our view is that basically what that's referring to there is the period of furlough, if that makes sense. So what that's saying is you have to have the agreement in place before that individual's particular period of furlough, but that doesn't have to be before the beginning of the claim period in question.
Yeah.
But it is really important that the new scheme does make it fairly clear that you can't put in place that agreement, the written agreement, retrospectively. So you can't stick someone on furlough and then do the agreement sort of several weeks later. It has to be contemporaneous. So making sure you're getting those agreements at the point you put someone in furlough is really important.
Yeah, but that is really helpful, because obviously the most recent period of lockdown was notified at quite short notice, and certainly some businesses will have had to move quickly to perhaps call people and say, you know, we're not opening on Monday, you need to go onto furlough, but perhaps it has taken a bit of time to get the written agreement in place and sent out. So okay there, but don't let that period drag on. You know, do an audit and make sure they've all got their agreements and that they're all clear on what the position is, particularly obviously for that HMRC audit, which can take place down the line.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think also
Right.
on the point of timing, Karen, in relation to claims as well, it's changed slightly. So from the 1st of November, you must submit claims by midnight, 14 calendar days after the month that you're claiming for. So you don't want to be missing those deadlines anymore. So for example, if you're going to make a claim for November, you need to submit that claim by the 14th of December.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, I'm glad we're in time to tell people that. So yes,
yes,
diarise those days.
yeah, keep an eye on that clock. Yeah,
definitely. Well, particularly over, you know, perhaps over the Christmas period, if people have got time off and so on, you know, are these things all in the system and being done in time? Really important, because if the business is relying on those costs being covered by furlough, you don't want to slip up by just not having pressed the button at the right time. Yeah, good. That's helpful. Great. Well, I think I just wanted to obviously thank our speakers this morning. I hope you've all found that useful. Those are the most common questions that we're being asked at the moment. Guidance is updated and changes, so do keep an eye out for our bulletins and briefings, because we do try to keep on top of all the changes and let you know as quickly as we can when we see them what the practical impact is. I also wanted to sort of just briefly mention, for employees that are on furlough, thinking about, you know, keeping in touch with them. They can still do training and so on. It can be really tough for people to be placed on furlough. You know, they're suddenly not attending work. Work will have potentially been a really important part of their lives, particularly for people who are living alone, you know, and this period has gone on for a long time now. So there will be pressures on people, and they're still our employees. So it's important to make sure that people are checking in with them and that they're being given opportunities. And also, I think, you know, if the whole business isn't closed and only part of the workforce is furloughed, being clear with other employees how much that period of furlough is potentially helping the financial position of the business, so that, you know, that you haven't got those resentments I think we've heard about from some businesses between furloughed employees, non-furloughed, some employees who are not on furlough feeling like they're working harder than ever, while their colleagues, you know, don't have to attend. I think it's about that overall picture that we are going through a very unexpected and bumpy time, and there are lots of different elements that business will need to use and different levers, and furlough may well be one of those. So just kind of that ongoing work really around describing why you're using it, what it's for, and making sure you look after the employees who are on furlough. Not an easy time for them. So next time we'll be doing a bit of a look ahead, hopefully a more hopeful look ahead, talking about things like vaccines. Can you force employees to have a vaccine? What's the position on employers buying vaccines privately for their employees? So that's all quite hopeful and optimistic that that's something that we need to look at next. Also, we've separately got a business immigration webinar coming up. So if we didn't have enough going on with COVID, of course, we've got the real start of the practical impact of Brexit happening at the beginning of January. If you employ EU workers, I absolutely recommend that you get in touch with us and watch that webinar, because it will have lots of information in about what you need to do to make sure that you are complying with your duties for employing those workers. The other thing I wanted to mention was that we have seen an increase in tribunal claims. I think that the latest statistics show they're up 18% over the summer. That's not uncommon in an economic climate like this, where it's more difficult for people to get jobs. We do tend to see a spike in claims, but do make sure that you have systems, if you're not in the office at the moment, to make sure that your post is being accessed in some way, just in case there is a claim form waiting for you. I've dealt with lots of cases recently where the employers haven't been there to receive the claim forms. They're just sent in the post by the tribunal, and then they've missed their short window of 28 days to lodge their defence. So just something to think about. I don't want to alarm you or put another task on your list of to-dos, but it's something to think about. And also, you know, just that picture in terms of tribunal claims, if they are increasing, just keeping an eye on that for contact from ACAS, and sort of thinking about if you've got any sort of problems that you knew about that might arise in a claim, just keeping an eye on what's happening with that. And obviously, if you need any advice, you can give any of us a call. So thanks for coming today. I hope that was useful, and we will be in touch with you soon with details of the next webinar. Thanks.